The wind came low and dry across the salt flats, a whisper that had traveled 1,000 miles without a tree to break its stride. It carried the grit of forgotten riverbeds and the scent of distant rain that would never fall here. Dust hung in the air like breath held too long, coating the raw timber of the station platform in a fine, rust-colored film. This was a place of endings, not beginnings. The iron rails ran east and west, 2 lines of cold promise that sliced the horizon in half, but for the town of redemption, they were mostly a reminder of the world that had passed it by. Silas stood apart from the others, a man built of timber and stone, his shadow a long, dark gash on the bleached planks. He was a giant, not just in height but in the sheer breadth of his shoulders, a size that made the world seem ill-fitted around him. He came to town only when necessity bit harder than solitude, his presence a quiet disturbance. The townspeople watched him from the corners of their eyes. They saw the grief that had settled into his bones like a permanent winter, the way his hands, large enough to snap a neck, were always so still. They remembered the fire, the small graves on the hill behind his homestead, and they looked away. He was waiting for a crate of fencing wire and a sack of flour, nothing more. He felt their judgment like a physical weight, the same weight he'd felt every season for 5 years. But today, there was something else drawing their collective gaze, a new target for their fear. She sat on a lone baggage cart, a statue carved from silence. She was Comanche, her face a map of hardship, her dark hair pulled back severely, revealing the proud, sharp line of her jaw. She was alone, and she was heavily pregnant, her state a bold, undeniable fact in this town of hidden sins and whispered condemnations. The train had come and gone, a puff of black smoke swallowed by the immense sky. It had disgorged a handful of weary travelers and deposited her like a piece of lost cargo. Now, the station master, a fretful man named Abernathy, was wringing his hands, his voice a reedy complaint against the vast indifference of the plains. She did not speak, did not look at him. Her gaze was fixed on the horizon, as if she could see the tracks running backward, back to a place she could not reclaim. Silas watched. He saw not just a woman, but an echo. He saw the stark terror held tight behind a mask of stone, the defiant stillness of a soul that had nothing left to lose and so would not surrender the dignity of its own silence. The town's collective murmur grew, a nest of snakes stirring in the heat. It was an old, ugly sound, the sound of fear looking for a place to bite. The station master's voice grew louder, sharpened by the impatience of the small crowd that had gathered. "You can't stay here," he insisted, gesturing with his entire body at the empty platform, at the town, at the whole unforgiving world. "This is private property. You have to move on." She gave no sign of having heard him. Her stillness was its own language, a refusal to engage with a world that had already cast her out. Sheriff Cobb arrived then, his boots kicking up little clouds of red dust. He was a man who wore his authority like an ill-fitting coat, tight across the shoulders and prone to bluster. He saw the woman, saw Silas watching, and his face hardened into a familiar mask of irritable duty. This was a problem to be managed, an untidiness to be swept away. He hitched his belt. "All right, what's the trouble, Abernathy?" The station master pointed a trembling finger. "She won't leave. Came in on the noon train. No ticket, no money. Just sat down." Cobb approached her, his shadow falling over her. He began, the word a courtesy stripped of all respect. "You're causing a disturbance." Silas felt a cold knot tighten in his gut. It was the same coldness he'd felt standing before the 2 small mounds of earth, the shovel heavy in his hands. He saw the way her hand rested protectively on the swell of her belly, a gesture of primal, desperate defense. He remembered another hand, smaller and paler, resting in the same way. The memory was a shard of glass in his heart. Cobb was leaning in now, his voice dropping to a low threat. "You understand English? You need to get." "Go on." Silas moved. It was not a decision so much as an inevitability, like a landslide loosed by a single stone. 2 long strides closed the distance. His sheer size eclipsed the sheriff, plunging the tense little scene into his shadow. Cobb straightened up, startled, his hand instinctively going to the butt of his pistol. The crowd fell silent. "There a problem here, Sheriff?" Silas's voice was rust, low and seldom used. Cobb's eyes narrowed. "This ain't your concern, Silas." "Seems to be," Silas said. His gaze did not go to the sheriff, but to the woman. He looked at her, really looked, and in her dark, defiant eyes, he saw the reflection of his own desolate landscape. He saw a resilience that shamed his own long retreat from the world. He turned his head slightly, enough to address her directly, his voice softer now, the rust sanded away. "You're coming with me." It was not a question. It was a statement of fact, a declaration made to the wind, to the town, to the ghosts that haunted them both. He extended his hand, palm up. It was a huge hand, scarred and calloused, but it was steady. She stared at it for a long moment. Then her eyes lifted to his. She searched his face, looking past the granite stillness for the truth of his intent. She saw no pity, no charity, only a quiet, unadorned recognition. A shared understanding of loss. With a slow, deliberate movement that felt as momentous as the turning of the earth, she placed her hand in his. Her fingers were slender and cool against his rough warmth. It was the first human touch he had willingly accepted in 5 years. He nodded once, a barely perceptible motion, and helped her to her feet. He did not look back at the sheriff or the stunned faces of the townspeople as he led her toward his wagon. The journey to the homestead was made in a silence as vast and profound as the landscape that surrounded them. The wagon wheels cut twin lines in the dust, a temporary scar on the face of the prairie. Silas held the reins with a practiced ease, his gaze fixed on the point where the pale, sun-bleached earth met the endless blue of the sky. He was intensely aware of the woman beside him. He could feel the rigid set of her shoulders, the shallow rhythm of her breathing. She clutched a small, tightly wrapped bundle in her lap as if it were the only anchor she had left in the world. He did not ask her name. He did not ask where she was from or where she had been going. The questions hung in the air between them, unspoken and unanswered, and their absence was a form of respect. He understood that her story was not a thing to be pried open like a crate of goods, but a wound that had to heal over in its own time. The land they traveled through was his land, a place of stark and lonely beauty. It was a country of hawk shadow and wind-bent grass, of rock and thistle and the occasional gnarled cottonwood clinging to the memory of water. It was a landscape that matched the geography of his own heart, emptied out, scoured clean, but enduring. Halfway there, as the sun began its long descent, he pulled the wagon to a halt. Without a word, he unhooked his canteen from the saddle horn, uncorked it, and held it out to her. She looked at the canteen, then at him. Her eyes, which had been fixed on the horizon, now met his for a second time. There was still fear in them, but it was overlaid with a deep, weary appraisal. She accepted the canteen, her fingers brushing his, and drank. She drank slowly, deliberately, as if reacquainting herself with the simple act of receiving a kindness. She handed it back, her lips still wet, and gave a single, shallow nod. It was a transaction of immense significance, a silent treaty signed in the dying light. They arrived as dusk was bleeding purple and orange across the western rim of the world. The homestead was just as he'd left it, a small, sturdy cabin of hewn logs, a lean-to for the horse, and a corral. It stood alone, a solitary outpost against the encroaching wilderness. To a stranger, it might have looked like a place of peace. But Silas knew it for what it was, a shrine to what he had lost, a place scrubbed clean of joy, its silence thick with the ghosts of laughter and lullabies. He led her inside the cabin. The air was cool and smelled of wood smoke and pine. A single room served as kitchen, living space, and his own sleeping quarters. A thick bearskin lay before a cold stone hearth. A rough table and 2 chairs stood in the center. Everything was spare, functional, and immaculately clean, the orderliness of a man at war with his own inner chaos. He gestured toward a closed door at the far end of the room. "In there," he said. She hesitated for a moment, then walked to the door and pushed it open. The room beyond was small, containing only a simple rope bed with a clean mattress ticking. The air was still, holding the faint, sweet scent of cedar. On one of the log walls, a patch of wood was lighter than the rest, the faint, ghostly outline of a child's drawing of a sun with a smiling face. She saw it instantly. Her hand went to her belly again, a gesture he was coming to recognize as her only outward expression of emotion. She did not ask about the drawing. He did not explain. He turned away and went back outside, returning a moment later with a folded wool blanket and a bucket of fresh water from the well. He placed them just inside her doorway without crossing the threshold. He was drawing a line, offering her a space that was entirely her own, a sanctuary within his sanctuary. Later, he built a fire in the hearth. The flames pushed back the encroaching darkness and threw dancing shadows on the walls. He cooked a simple meal of salt pork and beans in a cast-iron pot, the smell filling the small cabin. He spooned a portion onto a tin plate and set it on the table, then served himself. He motioned for her to sit. She came out of her room and took the seat opposite him. They ate in a silence that was different from the silence in the wagon. Here, in the warm glow of the fire, it was less a void and more a shared space, a quiet acknowledgement of their mutual exhaustion. They did not look at each other. They listened to the crackle of the fire, the scrape of spoon against tin, the sigh of the wind outside. When they were finished, he took the plates to the wash basin. She stood and, without a word, went back to her room, closing the door softly behind her. He unrolled his bedroll on the floor by the hearth, placing himself between her and the door to the outside world. He lay down in the dark, listening to the sounds of the house. He heard the faint creak of the rope bed as she settled. And then only the sound of the wind, a lonely voice confessing its sorrows to the night. The days fell into a rhythm, slow and deliberate as a heartbeat. The sun would rise, flooding the high plains with a clean, sharp light, and Silas would already be outside, his movements economical and sure. He mended the section of fence the wind had worried loose, the posts like stitches holding the land together. He split firewood, the rhythmic thud of the axe a steady punctuation to the morning's silence. He cared for his horse, his large hands gentle as he curried its coat. He was a man who spoke through action, his labor a long, unfolding prayer. She watched him from the cabin door, and then from the porch step. She did not venture farther. Her world, for now, was the small, protected space he had given her. At first, she did nothing but sit, a study in stillness, her hands resting in her lap. But slowly, a change began. One morning, he came in from his chores to find the main room swept clean, the floorboards bare and tidy. Another day, he found a shirt he had torn on the fencing wire laid out on his bedroll, the rip sewn with neat, tiny stitches. He looked at the thread, it was a dark blue, pulled from a small sewing kit he'd forgotten was in the bottom of a chest. The kit had been his wife's. He said nothing. He simply put the shirt on the next morning. The small acts of care were a language they were both beginning to understand. One afternoon, he saw her kneeling by the side of the cabin, in a small patch of earth protected from the worst of the wind. She was using her bare hands to break up the hard, dry soil, her brow furrowed in concentration. She was trying to make something grow in this stubborn land, an act of pure, irrational hope. He watched her for a long time, unseen, from the barn. The sight of her, her belly a round moon against the brown earth, trying to coax life from dust, stirred something in him that had long been dormant. It was not grief, and it was not yet joy, but something in between. The next morning, when she came out to the porch, she found a short-handled hoe and a small, burlap sack leaning against the wall. The sack was open, revealing a handful of harder-looking seeds, squash and beans, things that might just have a chance here. She looked toward the corral where he was working. He did not turn. He did not acknowledge her. He didn't have to. The hoe and the seeds were his reply. She picked them up and carried them to her small patch of earth. The world beyond the homestead had not forgotten them. It arrived one Tuesday in a cloud of dust, personified by Sheriff Cobb and his deputy, a younger man with nervous eyes. They reined in their horses a respectful distance from the cabin, but their presence felt like a violation, a trespass on the fragile peace that had settled there. Silas saw them coming and walked out to meet them, wiping his hands on his trousers. He stopped 10 feet from them, planting his feet as if he meant to take root. Tiva appeared in the cabin doorway, a shadow in the darkness, her hand on her belly. Cobb ignored Silas at first, his gaze fixed on her. His look was a mixture of suspicion and a crude curiosity that made Silas's hands clench into fists at his sides. "Silas," Cobb said, finally turning his attention to him. His tone was official, but it barely masked the personal animosity. Folks are talking. Silas waited. He knew how this worked. The town's fear, like a fever, had to run its course. They're saying you're keeping a squaw out here. A pregnant one, at that. It ain't right. It ain't decent. What's on my land is my business, Silas said, his voice flat and hard as packed earth. The deputy shifted uncomfortably in his saddle. Tiva remained motionless in the doorway, her silence a more powerful rebuke than any words. She was not a squaw. She was a woman, and she was the keeper of a life, and these men could not see it. It becomes my business, Cobb pressed, leaning forward, when it threatens the peace. We don't know who she is, where she came from. She could be dangerous. Her people could come looking. The threat hung in the air, absurd and yet potent. Her people. As if she had any left. Silas's gaze didn't waver. She's no threat. How do you know? She even speak? Or does she just do as you say? The insinuation was ugly and deliberate. Silas took a half step forward, and for a second, the deputy's hand moved toward his gun. But Silas stopped. Violence would solve nothing. It would only prove them right. She's staying, he said, the words falling like stones. You tell your folks to mind their own fences. Cobb's face flushed with anger. He had come expecting fear or shame, and he had found an unbreakable wall. He had come to exert his authority and had been met with a quiet defiance that rendered him powerless. He stared at Silas for a long moment, then at the woman in the doorway. He saw how Silas stood, a human shield between her and the world. This ain't over, Silas, Cobb spat, pulling hard on his reins. He wheeled his horse around and rode off, the deputy trailing in his wake. Silas watched them until they were small specks on the horizon. He did not turn around, but he knew she was still there, watching his back. The threat had not broken them. It had forged them. He was no longer just a man in a lonely cabin, he was a protector. And she was no longer just a refugee, she was under his care. They were, in this small, silent way, bound together against the world. That night, the sky broke. A storm, which had been gathering its strength on the far side of the mountains, rolled in across the plains. The wind came first, a low moan that grew into a ravenous howl, tearing at the roof of the cabin. Then came the rain, not in drops but in solid, driving sheets that turned the world outside into a churning, grey chaos. The storm sealed them in, shrinking their world to the four walls of the cabin. The fire in the hearth spat and hissed as stray drafts found their way down the chimney. Silas sat at the table, mending a bridle strap, his hands moving with slow, practiced precision. The work was a familiar comfort, an anchor in the tumult. Tiva sat on the porch step, just inside the doorway, watching the deluge. She seemed unafraid of the storm's fury. Perhaps it felt like a kindred spirit. For hours, the only sounds were the roar of the wind, the drumming of the rain, and the soft scrape of Silas's knife on the leather. Then, a new sound entered the space, soft and tentative at first. She was humming. It was a low, mournful melody, a tune that seemed woven from sorrow and resilience. It was a song without words, yet it told a whole story of wandering and loss. A lullaby. Silas's hand stilled. He kept his back to her, but he was listening with every fiber of his being. The simple, haunting tune slipped past his defenses and found the tender, bruised places in his memory. He saw his wife, Sarah, sitting in this very room, in that same rocking chair, humming a different tune but with the same gentle cadence to the child growing within her. The memory was so vivid it was a physical ache in his chest. The cabin, which for 5 years had been a hollow chamber of grief, was suddenly filled with a different kind of sorrow, not just his own, but hers, too. Her song was for a child, he knew. Perhaps one she had lost, or perhaps for the one she carried, a lament and a prayer all in one. The storm raged outside, and the lullaby wound its way through the noise, a thin, unbreakable thread of life. He did not turn. He did not speak. He sat perfectly still, letting the music wash over him, letting it crack open the shell he had built around his heart. For the first time, he was not just enduring his grief. He was sharing it. The storm passed in the night, leaving the air washed clean and smelling of wet earth and sage. The silence that followed was deep and resonant. In the quiet of the new morning, after their silent meal, she did something that changed the landscape of the cabin forever. She walked over to the stone mantelpiece above the hearth. On it sat a single object, a small, silver-framed tintype of a young woman with a kind smile and a small girl with bright, curious eyes. Sarah and Lily. The shrine Silas had tended to for 5 years. Tiva stood before it for a long moment, her expression unreadable. Then, she reached into the bodice of her dress and retrieved the small, deerskin bundle she always carried. With careful, reverent fingers, she unwrapped it. Inside lay 2 objects. One was a single, perfect eagle feather, its edges sharp and white. The other was a small horse, no bigger than her thumb, carved from dark wood, its surface worn smooth from years of handling. They were the last remnants of her world, the icons of her own lost tribe. One by one, she placed them on the mantelpiece. She set the small wooden horse next to the tintype, its head turned toward the little girl. She leaned the eagle feather against the frame, its tip gently brushing the image of the woman. She did not replace his memories, she added hers to them. It was a profound and intimate gesture, an unspoken story of her own losses laid bare. She was showing him her ghosts, trusting him with their care. Silas watched from the table where he was cleaning his rifle. He saw the whole thing. He saw her fragility and her strength. He saw the merging of their 2 desolate histories into one shared narrative of survival. His first instinct was to rise, to say something, to reclaim the space. But he held himself still. He recognized the act for what it was, a gift. An offering of trust more valuable than any words. He said nothing. He simply went back to oiling the rifle's action. His silence was his answer. It was his acceptance. The cabin was no longer just a monument to his grief. It was now a shelter for hers as well. The mantelpiece was no longer a shrine to the dead, but a testament to the living, to the ones who had been left behind. The first snow came early that year, a fine, tentative powder that dusted the plains in white. Then, as if the sky had finally made up its mind, it began to fall in earnest. Thick, heavy flakes descended in a silent, determined curtain, erasing the horizon, isolating the cabin in a world of white. It was in the deep heart of that storm, in the dead of night, that her labor began. It started with a low gasp from her room, a sound that cut through the muffled quiet of the snowstorm. Silas was awake instantly. He found her standing by the window, her hands braced against the sill, her back arched. Her face was pale in the moonlight reflecting off the snow, her eyes wide with a mixture of pain and fierce determination. There was no getting to town. There was no doctor, no neighbor, no help. They were utterly alone, trapped by the blizzard. For a moment, stark terror seized him. He, who had faced down charging beasts and armed men without flinching, was terrified of this. The memory of a different birth, one that had ended in a quiet, cold room and a double portion of grief, rose up to choke him. He felt the old helplessness, the rage at a world that gives and then takes away without reason. He was going to lose them. He was sure of it. But then she turned her head and looked at him. Her eyes were not pleading. They were commanding. In them, he saw not fear, but an ancient, unshakable strength. She knew what to do. She had the wisdom of generations of women in her blood. She could not speak the words, but she guided him with her hands, with her gaze. A gesture toward the hearth for more water to be boiled. A sharp nod toward the clean linens he had set aside weeks ago, as if anticipating this very moment. He became her hands. He who had only ever known how to build and to mend, to take life to sustain his own, was now being asked to serve it. He moved with a clumsy grace, his massive frame seeming out of place in the delicate, powerful orbit of birth. He followed her lead, his fear slowly receding, replaced by a focused, urgent purpose. The hours blurred into a primal rhythm of pain, effort, and whispered encouragements, his own voice, rough and unfamiliar, murmuring things he didn't know he knew. It was a raw and brutal and beautiful thing. And then, as the first hint of dawn pearled the edges of the snow-choked windows, a new sound broke the storm's hold. A cry. Thin, reedy, but utterly defiant. A cry that declared its own existence against the vast, white silence. It was the sound of hope. The storm had passed. The world outside was reborn, draped in a blanket of pristine, silent snow. The sun rose into a sky of impossible blue, striking diamonds from the drifts and casting long, soft shadows. Inside the cabin, the air was warm and still, filled with a new kind of quiet. It was the quiet of exhaustion, of relief, of a life just begun. Tiva was asleep in her bed, her face weary but peaceful. Nestled in the crook of her arm, wrapped in a soft wool blanket, was the baby. A son. His tiny face was wrinkled and red, his breath small, contented puffs of air. Silas sat in the rocking chair by the hearth, the one that had been empty for so long. He had not slept. He had been watching them, a silent, sleepless guardian. In his large, rough hands, he held a small piece of pine. Over the course of the long night, as he'd waited and watched, he had been carving. Now, the wood had taken the shape of a small bird, its wings half spread as if about to take flight. Its form was simple, almost crude, but it was imbued with all the hope and fear of the night. He rose slowly, his joints stiff, and walked to the bed. He stood over them, a giant shadow, looking down at the impossibly small child. With a tenderness that seemed at odds with his scarred fingers, he reached down and placed the small wooden bird into the baby's hand. The baby's tiny fingers, no bigger than a seed pod, curled instinctively around the offering. At that moment, Tiva's eyes opened. She had been awake, watching him. She looked from the baby's hand to Silas's face. Her eyes, clear and dark, held no fear. They held a deep, quiet gratitude that was more eloquent than 1,000 words. Then, for the first time since he had met her, she spoke to him. Her voice was soft, a little hoarse, but steady. He will need a name. Silas looked down at the child, then back at her. A whole lifetime of grief and healing seemed to pass between them in that single, shared gaze. The cold, hard knot he had carried in his chest for 5 years had finally, fully, dissolved. He was no longer just a man haunted by ghosts. He was here, in the warm light of a new morning, with a new life in his care. He gave a single, slow nod. His own voice, when it came, was thick with an emotion he could not name. "We'll find him one." He stood there as the sun climbed higher, flooding the small room with light. Outside, the land was no longer desolate. It was clean and new and waiting.